Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. We're going to go ahead and give it like a minute or so for everybody to kind of filter in, but thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. For all those that are just joining, we're giving a minute or two to kind of let people filter in, and then we'll get going. So just give us a few moments. Welcome, welcome. Hey, hey. I saw somebody waved, but it disappeared too quickly for me. So Scooby, thanks, man. Appreciate you. Alrighty, welcome, welcome. I think it looks like the attendee number kind of started to slow down, so we'll give it maybe one more minute until 1:02 Eastern, and then we'll go ahead and kick off. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Yeah, and so in the chat, Sarah or Helena kind of shared some information. So as we're going through the webinar, we're going to have time for questions and answers at the end, but go ahead and kind of ask your questions through the Q&A feature in Zoom, and then basically if it's something that I notice while I'm presenting and it's relevant to the specific kind of topic that I'm on, I may answer it. Depends on how well I notice it. Otherwise, we'll kind of save them till the end. But as you go, just kind of feel free to add questions to the Q&A feature, and I'll try to make sure that we can get them. Okay, so Jesse's saying that they can't hear anything. So I don't know. Just make sure, Sarah, I'm still good. Uh-oh. I don't know if you said something, but I couldn't hear you. Okay, you could hear. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thank you a lot. Okay. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is our red and blue, or red plus blue, how purple are you webinar. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about kind of what we think at SpecterOps purple teaming is. There's been, a little bit of consternation, maybe some different descriptions of the idea. We'll kind of try to reconcile those different ideas and present what we think purple teaming is. And the ultimate goal is at the end of the webinar, we're going to present or kind of talk about our service offering, which is a purple team service offering. Throughout the webinar, we're going to talk about what purple teaming is, but we're also going to explain how we think people can maximize the value of purple teaming. And then we'll kind of talk about how we do that. So, alrighty. So welcome. Let me get my cursor over to the right spot. So one of the first things that I wanted to do, purple teaming, just like red teaming or detection engineering or threat hunting, this is an abstract concept. Okay, so the problem with abstractions is they're really useful when everybody's on the same page, right? So when I'm talking to somebody and we have the same concept, the same foundation that we've built an abstraction on top of, it's really useful because now I don't have to explain every detail about what I'm talking about every time that I mention the thing. I could just use this abstract term. The problem is that with abstractions is there's sometimes a divergence between what two individuals, two organizations, or a community as a whole understand that abstraction to be, and then you end up with this problem where you think you're talking about the same thing, but you're not, right? And so the first thing that I wanted to do was kind of do a little bit of a review of different definitions of purple teaming. This is by no means meant to be comprehensive or anything like that, but I just want to kind of go through how different organizations, and this was literally, I searched like purple teaming on Google and pulled out what I think to be is a relatively diverse set of definitions. And then I'm going to kind of show how all those things kind of come together. So the first one was like the first result on Google by Coursera. I don't have a specific author, but they basically said it's a collaborative approach to cybersecurity that brings red and blue teams together to test and improve an organization's security posture. Okay, so red and blue working together and with a focus on improving security posture. SANS, their security 699 class in the description, it's focused on purple teaming. And so the class is talking about educating students on how adversarial techniques can be emulated and detected, right? So there's kind of a red and blue element there. Attack IQ says that purple teaming is to bring blue and red functions together. GitLab says something about better understand our organization's ability to detect and respond to real-world attacks. Okay. Daniel Miesler, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, says that it's a function designed to enhance the information sharing between teams and the ultimate effectiveness of an organization's red and blue teams, right? With a major focus on improving an organization's defense. Jonathan Reber said blue team becomes purple when it emulates the adversary as a means of self-evaluation. I want to focus on that self-evaluation aspect there. Zena Olson, who I think probably has one of the best resources, I actually shared the link down there at the bottom. I believe that for her PhD thesis, or part of her PhD, she did a kind of like a study on all the different resources that one might use for purple teaming, and they're all kind of shared in that GitHub repo there. But she says it refers to multiple cybersecurity teams working together to improve an organization's security posture. Tiber EU says that we actively pinpoint weaknesses in protection and detection capabilities. And then Christian Pescariu said enables defenders to gain better understanding of adversary TTPs. So if I were to summarize that, at first I actually expected these to just be all over the place and not be a coherent kind of thread between all these different definitions. But as I started to think about what are these people saying, I realized that there's potentially, they all are in harmony, but they're potentially focused at different levels of abstraction. So remember, purple teaming is this abstract concept, and different people are going to define that at different levels of depth, right? And it actually starts to make sense. So it's like purple teaming, generally speaking, is collaboration between offense, which is red, and defense, which is blue. The problem is that you have to understand what are you trying to achieve as a result of that collaboration, right? And so one of the things that seems to be a general consensus is that you want to collaborate to increase the familiarity with or understanding of adversary tactics, techniques, and procedures, okay? Well, why do I care about understanding adversary tactics, techniques, and procedures? Well, the reason is so that I could do a self-evaluation of my existing security posture, right? And then what do you do with after you've self-evaluated? Well, ultimately, you're going to want to improve an organization's security posture or defenses. And this is going to kind of come up in, I think, like 3 major categories. There's probably some wiggle room for adding more categories, but preventative controls, can we stop this attack from happening in the first place? Detective controls, maybe we can't stop it, but we could at least know that it happened if it does. And response procedures. Once we've identified that some malicious activity has occurred, can we actually do anything about it, right? So just because you have, for instance, a response procedure doesn't mean that it achieves the outcome that you expect it to when you employ it. And so one of the things that we might be interested in is evaluating or validating the efficacy of those response procedures, for instance. Okay. One thing that I want to go back to, this was kind of my first introduction to this idea. Roberto Rodriguez in 2017 wrote a blog post called "How Hot Is Your Hunt Team?" And what he did was he created this this heat map, essentially, which is at the time, this is what MITRE ATT&CK looked like. This is the attack matrix. And what he did is he kind of plotted his detection capability, or at least a hypothetical detection capability, onto the map or onto the matrix to kind of get an idea for where he's strong and where he's weak, right? So the idea was, if you could look at like something like bypass user account control, bypass UAC, and you could say we have detections for that, and we have generally a pretty good feeling that we have a good grasp of that problem. Now, one major problem with this, and I think Roberto is the one that brought this to my attention, is that this is all kind of based off of feeling, right? So it's like there's a binary aspect of we do have a detection rule, and then or we don't, right? So that's binary. But then the question is how effective or efficacious is that detection rule or that set of detection rules addressing this technique? And that's kind of like you just have this general gut feeling. And that's one of the things that we're trying to kind of move beyond. So the heat map idea, I give credit to Roberto because he's at least the first person that I saw come out with this. But I think generally speaking today, we have this, we have a general understanding in the industry that the heat map is maybe a good starting point, but it's very hard to understand. Should something be yellow? Should something be red? In this case, red means better coverage. It's hotter, right? So red, should something be yellow? Should it be orange? Should it be red? That's kind of just like a guessing game to some degree, right? Okay. So let's lay out the problem statement that we're trying to address, or the different types of problems. So when it comes to purple teaming, there's this idea of like, do our security controls achieve their stated or explicit goals, right? So for instance, this is a hyperbolic example, but it's not unrealistic necessarily. So if our goal were to build a detection that identifies processes named mimikatz.exe, one question is, if a process is named mimikatz.exe, how certain am I that my detection rule will alert on that, right? So there's this idea that I have this explicit idea that I want to achieve through my detection rule, and how efficacious is my solution to being able to achieve that goal, right? But there's a second, what I think is more important question, which is our goal scoped properly, right? Did we even create the correct goal? And so like the Mimikatz example, the reason why I made that hyperbolic was because I think it's fairly obvious to most people in the industry that a detection goal where the end state of the detection is only to detect processes named mimikatz.exe is likely not to be a sufficient or robust goal, right? Because, for instance, we've all seen examples where people change the process name to mimidogs.exe, and that's just the start of all these different variations or variables that can be changed. And so there's a question of what is the proper scope, right? And the idea here is that detection in particular, but prevention also, is a predictive exercise, right? So it's not about what we know the attacker is going to do because it hasn't happened yet. We're looking into the future. What we're doing is we're trying to create a rule that's going to detect, right, the thing that the attacker is most likely to do, right? So we don't know what they're going to do. We might not even know what they're capable of doing, but we're trying to make our best educated prediction as part of our detection effort. And so then the other aspect of purple teaming that I mostly see is this idea of like, if the answer to either of those is no, right, my detection doesn't even achieve its stated goal, or the stated goal is probably not the correctly scoped, right, then what do we do? And I think this comes down to, there's an aspect of one of the problems that we face is a lot of people are dealing with, some people have organic detection rules or preventative controls, which is your organization created these things. And so you have a pretty good idea of how they work, what they're intended to do, all that kind of stuff. But the vast majority of detection rules and preventative controls are supplied to most organizations by vendors, and they tend to be relatively opaque, which means that we don't know how they work. And so what happens is the vendor will say, we have a detection rule for credential dumping from LSAS. And you just have to kind of like take that as a statement of faith. And so one of the things that we could do with purple teaming is kind of validate whether or not having faith in that statement is actually a good idea. Okay. So what I want to do is kind of talk about some of the existing solutions that I've seen for purple teaming and the pros and cons of kind of each. Okay. So the first one is kind of this adversary emulation plans kind of approach, which is, this is meant to be pretty generic on purpose. I'm trying to kind of cover a broad scope here, and so don't, there may be slight areas where it's not accurate of somebody's particular example, but generally speaking, the protocol that you would follow if you were using this adversary emulation plan is you have to execute some coherent attack path to achieve some objective, right? And you want to base your selection of procedures or techniques, or however you want to define that, on explicitly observed examples. This usually would be like threat informed, or you'd have some sort of threat intelligence that would feed into how you choose which things you do. Okay. The benefits of this approach is that you could test a broad range of techniques, right? So you're going to test a broad range of techniques across a relatively robust kind of attack path. And you're going to simulate a real attack path. So something that has ostensibly been used in real life. But the limitations are that the attack path must be coherent, generally speaking. It has to flow together. And as a result of that, generally speaking, for each technique that you choose to execute, you're going to choose one or two different variations of that technique. So like for lateral movement, maybe you observed somebody use WMI when Win32 process creates lateral movement, right? And so you're only going to do that in one way. You're not going to go through the gamut of all the different ways that somebody might leverage WMI for lateral movement, for instance. Okay. Also procedural variations. So the tools or like the procedures that you use are often limited to kind of known or previously observed variations. And I generally have this idea that just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean it's not being used, right? So what you've observed is a subset of what's actually happening. And so there's a limitation to that aspect. And as a result, past observations are not necessarily predictive of future actions, right? So just because we saw somebody do this a year ago doesn't mean that that's what we should expect for them to do in the future. Now, just to give some examples of what this would be without being too specific, red team exercises are a good example of this. And this is actually one of the reasons why, if your goal is to identify the weakness or the validate the efficacy of a detection or a preventative control. A red team, generally speaking, is not the way to achieve that. It's just the wrong protocol for trying to achieve that outcome, because what it is it's doing one variation of the attack. And so if you detect it, it's like, cool, we detected that, but does that mean that we have a robust detection, or does that mean that they just happen to use the one way that we were going to be able to detect that attack technique? Another one is MITRE ATT&CK EDR evaluations. We've all seen, as a result of that, all the vendors say we had 100% coverage, right? And we all, that's one of those things to where on its face, you understand that that's not very meaningful of a result, because it's like, if everybody has 100% coverage when we know that people are being breached, then something's strange here. And I think, like, we had a podcast with Jamie Williams for the DCP podcast, and we talked through this. And honestly, the problem is that people were trying to use red team exercises or EDR evaluations in this particular case to answer a question that the protocol or the exercise was not designed to answer. And that's a big problem. You have this with, like, antivirus. When people say antivirus sucks or antivirus is dead, the problem is not that antivirus sucks, it's that they're expecting antivirus to do something that it's not designed to do. And so there's this idea of kind of aligning your expectations with the protocol that's being employed. Okay. And now we could go into this idea of breadth versus depth. So it's like, I don't know, there's 250 different attack techniques, probably more than that. Do we want to test each one once? That's, in the military, we call that the inch deep, mile wide type approach, right? So you're going to give one variation of each attack technique, and then you're going to validate whether or not you're able to detect that one variation. Or do you want to go with the depth approach, which is, we're only going to look at a few different techniques, but we're going to try to give a very robust representation of what those techniques and the variations that are contained within that represents, right? So we're trying to give a representative sampling. Okay, and one of the big problems here is that these two things counteract each other, or they're inversely related, right? So the deeper you go, the less breadth you can have, and the more breadth you have, the more shallow you're going to go, because you have limited resources. Okay, now one of the things that I like to do is tell stories about these kind of like epiphany moments that I had, to where it tells me that there's more to this, or maybe I need to look into this idea more. One of the big epiphany moments for me was this transition from PowerShell to C#. So a lot of you that have been around the industry for 5 years or so knew that PowerShell was extremely popular. In fact, Red Canaries, I think on Monday, is doing a webinar talking about how PowerShell was the most commonly observed technique over the past year. And so that maybe it's still extremely popular. But from a red team perspective, what we observed at SpecterOps was that Microsoft had made a number of different changes to how PowerShell works, and that included visibility and in-memory inspection and all kinds of different things that made it much easier from the red teamer's perspective to detect PowerShell malware or prevent PowerShell malware from being able to execute. And so what they did is they said, okay, well, we're not going to use PowerShell anymore. We're going to move all of our capability to C#. And so this picture is an example of a tool called SharpDump, written by Will Schroeder, one of our colleagues at SpecterOps. And what he does, he even says it in the description. SharpDump is a C# port. So for those that aren't familiar, porting is when you take code that's written in one programming language and you rewrite it like basically verbatim in a different programming language. And so it's a C# port of PowerSploit's out minidump, which is a PowerShell version of this tool. And so what he did is he took the PowerShell version and did the exact same thing, but in C#. And it works. And that tells you, the fact that they're doing the exact same thing, but they just swapped out the language, that tells you that our detections potentially, or our solutions, weren't very robust to variation. Okay. And kind of as, I don't know if it's as a result of that, but then like kind of something that is in the same vein is this dynamic test cases. So you probably see this from like something like Atomic Red Team or different breach and attack simulation products. This is where basically what they do is they create a number of test cases that represent adversary tradecraft. So you have some technique that you select and you come up with a bunch of different test cases and you're going to run those. You execute those test cases in the environment, and then you observe the results. This is kind of dynamic malware analysis, but in this case, you're doing dynamic detection or preventative control analysis, right? So you execute the test cases and you observe what happens. Okay. The cool thing is that it allows for a more complete idea of how the controls work, right? So you see it worked for this test case, but not this test case, and you could make some inference about that. It's simplified and streamlined because everything's atomic. You don't have to have this coherent attack path, and then it's repeatable, generally speaking. Now, the limitations is that the efficacy of this approach is dependent on the representative nature of the selected test cases, right? So if you choose test cases that are too similar, then you're not getting much value from it. But if you, and we'll talk, that's basically what I'm going to talk about. So we'll get into that in a second. And then, like I mentioned on the depth versus breadth slide, the idea is that the deeper you go, the more you have to sacrifice breadth as a result of that. Okay. And so this goes into similarity, right? So this question of, as you know, how do we measure similarity between different variations of an attack technique? So imagine that we have two tools, sharp dump and out mini dump. And both of those things from the attacker's perspective do the same thing. They dump the memory of LSAS, which allows them to extract clear text credentials from memory, right? When I look at that, those are literally different tools, right? They have different names. If I were to compile them and run an MD5 hash against them or a SHA-256 hash, the hash would be literally different. But the problem with cryptographic hashing is that it tells about absolute difference, but not relative difference. So you can say these tools have different hashes and therefore are not the same, but you're not able to say how much was changed as a result as a result, right? And so what the industry is kind of like, especially in digital forensics, this is really interesting. They've come up with different ways to do comparative hashing. And so one example would be piecewise or fuzzy hashing. If you're familiar with like SSDeep, that's an example of a tool that does this. But generally speaking, what they do is they, instead of hashing the entire file, they hash segments of the file, and then they compare those, and they're able to say this thing is mostly the same as this other thing, and so they're more similar. And this is going to be good for, like, it kind of assumes that changes will be localized, such as changing every reference to Mimikatz to Mimidogs, or like maybe removing Benjamin Delpy's name from the credits of Mimikatz source code so that it's not there. And then there's a second approach that, as far as I know, is something that came about from Mandiant, but I'm not 100% sure if that's where it originally came from, called imp hashing. And the idea is that malware, generally speaking, and this actually goes towards what we're going to get into, generally speaking, will pull its functionality from different DLLs on the system, right, through API functions. And those are going to show up in something called the import table in a portable executable file. And what you can do is you can basically compare the import table of one file to the import table of the other file, and you can infer similarity based on the similar types of functionality that might exist. So that's something that allows you to compare functionality, but maybe it's not super robust to like reordering and taking things in and out and all that kind of like major changes. Okay, so what I want to do, so I referenced in the title the spectrum of security, and I think it's really useful for us to think about things in the context of a spectrum. So there's variations on the like example. So there's always like Mimikatz, you could say, is the prototypical version of credential dumping from LSAS. But then there's going to be a number of different variations. Some of those variations are going to be very slight variations, and some of those variations are going to be very like profound variations, right? But they still achieve the same outcome, and so they're still the same technique, even though they're very different. And so the idea here is that we have the electromagnetic spectrum, and we could kind of rely on that. So we have, like, for instance, cosmic rays, gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet, and then we have the visible light spectrum. And so what I want to do is I want to switch that up and kind of present this to you in the context of like defense evasion is the tactic. And there's a bunch of different techniques: abuse of elevation controls, access token manipulation, schedule tasks. Those are all different techniques under defense evasion. But then there's process injection, which is what we're going to look at. And there's a whole range, even though we don't have names for these things, there's a whole range of variation that exists within process injection. And like, you could think of this as sub-techniques or as procedures, but we're going to kind of look into that and explore it. Okay, so you always, like, when you start to say how different is something, you always have to, it's all relative, right? And so you always have to start with kind of what they call the prototypical version, or the kind of traditional version. For process injection, so Mimikatz, like I said, is a prototypical version of LSAS credential dumping. It's kind of like, what is the Band-Aid or the Kleenex equivalent, right? And so for process injection, we have kind of like classic shellcode injection, which we'll get into here in a second, but that's going to be our starting point. But then the question is as we start to build out these unit test cases, which again, I think is the most effective way that we have currently to try to validate the relative coverage of a detection rule, do we want to minimize the difference between tests, or do we want to maximize the difference between tests? And that's kind of like the ultimate question. Now, my answer to that is that we want to maximize the difference, because if we maximize the difference, then we can make a larger inference as a result of our testing, right? So if for instance, I have these two examples, so number 1 and number 2, then all I'm able to do, let's say I detect both. That's like the best case scenario. I detect both tests. What I could do is I can infer that I have the ability to literally detect. So literally I'm being told I could detect test 1 and test 2, but I could also infer that I should be robust to the changes that exist between number 1 and number 2, right? But that's a really small area, right? It's all green, for instance. But if I do test 1 and test 2 and I detect both of those, now I can infer that I'm robust to the changes that exist between 1 and 2, which would cover red, orange, yellow, and green, for instance. Okay. All right. So then the question, when we start talking about test selection, the question is how do we measure, similarity, for instance, right? And I think the answer is that we don't really have a very good way of doing that as an industry. And so as a result, what we've done is we've kind of started to use quantity as a proxy for quality. And so the idea is, generally speaking, if we include more tests, then naturally we're probably going to get more coverage, right? But the problem is that I think is fundamentally misunderstands the amount of variation that actually exists. So we're going to get into this in a second. I'll explain how I derive these numbers. But for instance, when I look at process injection, I've identified 4.4 million different combinations of API functions that would allow you to perform process injection. Okay. Access token manipulation, 2.5 million. LSAS credential dumping is relatively simple, but it's still 33,000 different combinations of functions that I've personally identified. That there's probably more, right? But that's the number that I've quantified. And so the idea is that, let's say if I choose 10 different tests, what are the chances that I choose the optimal set of 10 out of 4.4 million? And the answer is very, very low, essentially, right? And so the question is how would I maximize my ability to pick the optimal set? So what we see as a result of this kind of relying on quantity over quality, as a proxy for quality, I should say, is that we find that a lot of these testing suites will end up choosing, in many cases, not all cases, in many cases, a very narrowly scoped set of tests. The idea is that, generally speaking, changes between malware samples are going to be relatively small, and there's some reasons for that I'll explain in a little bit. But the idea is that the changes are going to be very small. So if we just randomly select things that we encounter, then the changes are going to be relatively small, and we're going to have a very narrowly scoped kind of test set. And this goes into this idea of sampling. I don't think I need to explain that very much, but the idea is that if you have 4.4 million variations, you're very unlikely to test all 4.4 million, and you probably don't need to, right? But what you need to be doing is selecting a representative sample set, right? And then as the better your sample set is, the more you can infer as a result of your test, right? So for instance, if you picked all the gray, like number 5, number 9, and number 3, that would not be representative of the overall population. So you're going to have a limited ability to make inferences from your testing. Okay. And so eventually what we want to get to is something like this, right? To where what we're doing is we maximize the difference. So from number 1, we go to number 2, which is kind of like maximally differentiated in one direction, right? And then after that, we want to go to number 3 because that's the next most maximally differentiated. And then we kind of can start narrowing in our differences. And the idea would be, if I could detect number 1, that's great, but that doesn't tell me anything because maybe I just happen to have a signature that was specifically targeted at that variation. And then I run number 2 and I could detect number 2. It's like, cool, I'm good to go on going that direction. And then I run number 3 and I don't detect it. Now there's some problem between number 1 and 3 that is causing me to miss it. And so I can start to look at the differences between number 1 and number 3 to start inferring where that issue is kind of coming from. Okay. So this goes into our approach, right? So how do we solve that qualitative issue? So this is kind of a fun picture. So I got my start in in cybersecurity in the military, in the Air Force, and we were on the Air Force hunt team. And so the story that I'm going to tell has to do with some time in the military, and I actually found a picture of like the SOC that I worked in. So this was I all this PowerShell that's running kind of here. I wrote the code for that, so that's pretty fun. And then we were really obsessed with doing ASCII art. Our unit was called the skulls, so you see that there's a bunch of skulls all over the place. Anyway, kind of a fun thing. So this is another one of those epiphany stories, but I was at a cyber exercise, DoD or US Cybercom cyber exercise called Cyber Flag. And we were the US Air Force hunt team, and we were going against like NSA Red and the Air Force Red team and that type of thing. And one day, the White Cell, which is kind of like the referee of the exercise, they know kind of like what are the training objectives that the blue team's trying to get, right? And they're trying to make sure that those are being facilitated by the red team. They came in and apparently we had been missing something for a long period of time. And so they came in and they said, hey, the red team has a golden ticket. What are you going to do about that? And we were like, oh, well, we're going to go detect that golden ticket. Now, this was like probably September, October, November of 2014, which was like 2 months after golden tickets were first introduced at DEF CON or Black Hat. And so the answer was, we have no idea what golden tickets are. And so as soon as they left, we all looked at each other and we're like, hey, do you guys know what a golden ticket is? And everybody's like, nope, no idea. And so then we just kind of were like, well, I guess we're not going to do anything about that. And we just kind of kept going about our day trying to figure out what was going on. We were also like in a secure facility where we didn't have internet, so we couldn't look it up either. But the story here, the idea is that you can't prevent or detect what you don't understand. And so there's this idea that your understanding of an attack technique or of a phenomenon or whatever you want to call it is going to be a limiting factor in your ability to address it. Okay. And so one of the things that we want to do is we want to start trying to understand fundamentally how different attack techniques work. So just like purple teaming is an abstract concept, which we went through and tried to define kind of and figure out exactly what people mean when they say purple teaming. What we're trying to do now is we're trying to say, what do people mean when they say process injection? Because process injection is an abstract concept. Shellcode injection is like here it says classic shellcode injection. That's the title that people give to it. That's also an abstraction. And so what we want to do is start digging into it. So a lot of times what you could do, especially if it's open source, but you could also potentially reverse engineer the sample. You can look at the different function calls that are being made. So here we see open process, virtual alloc, write process memory, create remote thread. If you're like me, when I first started in the industry, I was told, hey, if you see open process, virtual alloc EX, write process memory, create remote thread, you're seeing injection. And I had no idea what any of those things were. And so what I would do is I would just run strings across a bunch of binaries and look for those words. And if they popped up, I'm like, that's malware. And like, that's not how it actually works, right? So what we want to do is we want to see the sequence of these things kind of in tandem, right? And so we can actually graph that out. So I've taken this source code and I've simplified it in a graph format where I say, hey, we're calling this process or this open process function virtual alloc EX, write process memory, create remote thread. Okay. So then we can start digging into it. And the way that this actually works is when I call kernel 32 open process, that's kernel 32 is the DLL that implements this API function open process. What actually happens behind the scenes is there's a number of different functions that are called. And I call that the function call stack, right? And so the idea is I call kernel 32 open process, and that calls something called API MS WinCore process threads -L1-1-0 open process. That's a DLL. Then it calls kernel base.dll open process. Then it calls ntdll.dll nt open process. And then it makes a syscall. And the syscall is the transition from kind of user mode execution to kernel mode execution. Okay. And so the interesting thing is that we can evaluate the call stacks for all of these functions that we observed, right? And this actually creates variation. And so what attackers have realized is that, yes, there is kind of like the traditional set of functions that you can call, but you can actually choose any arbitrary function from basically one arbitrary function from each of these call stacks and combine them, and it will still allow you to achieve the same outcome. And so one thing that we've seen that's become really popular is this idea of like, we're going to make direct syscalls. And so what they do is they say, instead of calling the Win32 functions that are kind of at the top, what we're going to do is we're going to call the syscalls, which are at the bottom of the call stack, right before the transition to the kernel. And the idea is that some EDR vendors or EDR telemetry is user mode telemetry. And so if that telemetry is being generated in user mode, and I skip over all the different function calls that are in user mode straight to the syscall, I have an opportunity to evade detection, essentially. And so that's kind of what they do. And so those are two different what I call functional variations that are available to attackers. These are 2 of the 4.4 million functional variations that I talked about. But they could also choose these like kind of arbitrary hypothetical attack paths, right? And what we find is that we could actually calculate the total number of possible attack paths represented by these function call stacks. So what we do is we take, there's 5 functions in this call stack, 6 in the second one, 5 in the third one, and 6 in the fourth one. And we can multiply those numbers together. So 5 times 6 times 5 times 6 is 900, right? And so what we find is that there's 900 total functional variations that are represented by just these call stacks, okay? And so the attacker can choose any of those that they want. And we would have to be resilient to the changes that are inherent in that, right? Now, this is interesting because most EDR sensors are going to be robust to these types of changes in most cases, but not always. And one of the problems that we face is most of us don't know whether our particular EDR sensor is robust to these types of changes in this particular case. So this is something that we want to dig into. Johnny Johnson and I gave a presentation at DEF CON that's available on YouTube. And so that's where we talked about kind of how you deal with testing across these 900 variations, or these kind of like what I call interprocedural variations, okay? Now, I like to think about this in the context of like this physician scale. I don't know how often people encounter these types of scales anymore, because usually they're digital now, but as a kid, I was fascinated by these. And so the idea here is you have like this heavier weight that's like 25 or 50 pounds. And then you have this kind of smaller weight, which is kind of micro changes, maybe 1/10 of a pound or something like that. And generally speaking, the way that you use this is you make the most significant change first, right? So you move the 25 or 50 pound weight until basically you have too much, and then you back off one, and then you make micro changes after. So worrying about these functional variations is akin to worrying about this micro change first. So then the question is how do we deal with macro changes, or kind of like the big weights, right? And the answer is that from the attacker's perspective, or the malware developer's perspective, which function they use is transparent. Like sometimes you have to do slightly different things to use, you know, the syscall versus the Win32 API call, but it gives you the same exact functionality, right? Because if you call the Win32 API call, you're going to call the syscall at the end of the day anyway. And so the malware developer's like, I might as well just call the syscall, okay? Now, from the EDR perspective, if the EDR has a kernel component, then it's going to be like the difference between these functions is going to be irrelevant. And so what we could do is we could use a layer of abstraction, which I call operations, to group this entire chain together. So the idea is that no matter which of these 5 functions you call, I'm going to call that process open, right? And so I could represent that all 900 of those functional variations as a single operational chain. And so that gives me the opportunity to basically say, hey, it doesn't matter which one of those variations you use, I'm talking about it in the context of this operational chain, okay? And the interesting thing, I'm using MDE as an example, but this is true for most EDRs. It may be slightly different on what things you have visibility into, but in this case, what we see when we collect telemetry is actually the operation. So for instance, there's this event called the open process API call event. And that even though it's called open process and that's the high level function, it's actually based in the kernel. And so what we're actually seeing is the process open operation. We have a NT allocate virtual memory remote API call, and that's seeing this memory allocate operation, write process memory API call, process write, create remote thread API call, thread create, right? And so the idea here is there's 2 things. One is you see operations, but the second thing is that you can only see one operation at a time. And so that's something to keep in mind when you're building detections. So one of the questions is which of these operations should I be focusing on? And we'll talk about that kind of at the end. So my kind of quote that I go with is align your conception to your perception. So if we see operations, if that's how we see the world, we should think about the world in operations. So process injection is too high level. It's too abstract. We don't actually, you never get an event that says, this is process injection. No, you get an event that says a thread was created, basically, right? And then the functional level is too high resolution, right? You're wasting energy because the differences between different function variations are basically irrelevant in most modern use cases, okay? All right. So then we could get into this idea of like, how can we measure or predict the types of changes that are likely to come about? And one thing that I like to use is like natural selection as kind of a proxy for how we predict how malware is going to evolve. So imagine that your network is the environment. So instead of like a biological environment, we have a cybernetic environment or whatever. And so what we could do is we can look at the different types of selective pressures. Particularly, this is the case with preventative controls, and we can start to make predictions about the types of kind of changes that are going to occur. So imagine that we have a signature that says anytime something's called mimikatz.exe, we're not going to let it run. It's some sort of like app whitelisting. Well, what people are going to do, and like we've all seen this, right, is, oh, I just changed cats to dogs, right? So I use like a little sed rule, and I just change everywhere where it says cats, I'm going to change it to dogs, and now I bypass everything, right? And so that would be like a small selective pressure. A medium selective pressure might be API focused, right? So it's like, hey, we're going to hook the create remote thread API function. And then the attacker's like, well, I don't need to call create remote thread. I'm going to call the syscall, which is int create thread ex instead, right? And so that allows them to bypass that type of control. And then there's the large ones, which is we're going to look at the execution method, which in this case is thread create. And then the attacker is going to say, okay, I can't create a thread, but what can I do? Well, I can potentially hijack or use something called an asynchronous procedure call to get some existing thread to execute my code. And so the idea is that attackers will often implement this minimal stimulus necessary principle, which is don't do more than you need to in order to make it happen. But the idea is we want to make what they need to do more and more profound as defenders. Okay, so I'm going to compare some different variations, and we could talk about them. So this first one's that classic shell code, but then we have this variation, which is asynchronous procedure calls. And the thing that I want to point out is that the preamble, which is like, how do I get the data, my code into memory? That's the same here, right? So we allocate memory, and then we write that code to the memory buffer that we allocated. But what you'll see where it changes, instead of creating a new thread, we're going to open an existing thread, and then we're going to task it through this thing called an APC. Okay. Then we have a third one, which is section mapping. And so we could do the same type of analysis. We see that this file mapping approach also creates a thread. You could actually use the APC as well. But what they change here is they change the memory allocation aspect of it. And so the idea is that as an attacker, which one of these you use is going to be dependent on the type of selective pressure that exists. So if you perceive that they're targeting thread creation as their detection rule targets thread creation, then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go this direction because you want to take away thread creation. But if what you perceive is that they're looking for you to do like virtual alloc ex write process memory, then you're like, I don't need to do that either because I could change that aspect of the kind of operational change. Okay. Then we have like, this one's a little bit more profoundly different. This is atom bombing. And I got references down here at the bottom if anybody wants to check that out. But what we see is that they've changed literally everything, right? So they're taking advantage of an existing thread through thread open APC create, but then they're using these things called atoms to be able to write their code to memory and reference it. So we see if we compare shellcode, it's completely different. But if we compare the APC, they actually use thread open, APC create, but they allocate the memory in different ways. And then the last one is thread execution hijacking, which is essentially write the code in the same way, but we're going to basically take over an existing thread in a different way than using an APC, right? So that's that. Okay, and so these create operation change. This is just kind of a sampling of operational chains that kind of give us an idea for the types of variation that we might encounter. But that's also how we might start to say changing the operational chain is actually a profound difference, right? So if I take away the creation of a thread and your whole detection strategy is based on the idea that in order to inject code, you have to create a thread, I've now just completely invalidated the assumptions that you're making in your detection rules, right? And so what we want to do is we want to say, what are the types of assumptions that we're making or that we're prone to make? What are the ways that attackers might invalidate those? And how do we represent that in our test cases? Okay. And so this would be basically equivalent, the operational chains or the operational differences, those are going to be equivalent to moving the major scale, like the major weight on the scale. Okay. So just to kind of finish up, so this is a webinar where we're wanting to kind of introduce our new Purple Team service, but in kind of like a SpecterOps tradition, we have lots and lots of free or cheaper resources for people to kind of meet you where you're at. So one really cool resource that I'm particularly proud of is a blog series that I've been working on called On Detection. And a lot of these ideas that I just kind of glossed over, like how do you do the function call stack? How do you analyze that? How do you build out these operations? That's all discussed in this blog series. That's free. It's freely available right now, and it's going to continue to be added to, and we're going to add more and more ideas to it. We also are offering at NorthSec in Montreal, May 18th and 19th, what I think is free with your conference attendance workshop. Is a 4-hour workshop on malware morphology, which is basically how would you take a malware sample and analyze it to kind of that level of resolution. And that's going to be 4 hours. And from my perspective, it's free. We also hopefully will plan to give this in different venues in the future. So if you can't make it to Montreal in May, that's fine. Hopefully we'll have a way to give this either online or in person in different places. We also have a training class, right? That's going to be something that costs money, but hopefully it's relatively cheap compared to like a service offering or some sort of consulting engagement. And that's going to be, I think the next public offering is at Black Hat USA, but we also plan to host that publicly outside the context of Black Hat in the future. And that's going to focus on some of the same ideas, but obviously over 4 days, we could go deeper in the idea. Then we have Purple Team Service, which is like an engagement style consulting service, and detection and response program development, which is the idea would be more investment, but we're trying to help an organization build out their own capability to do this organically in the future. So let's talk about the Purple Team Service for just a second before we go to questions. So the idea here is that kind of what we think our major differentiator is for this Purple Team Service is our deliberate kind of sample variation selection. So what tests are we implementing, and how do we show that those tests are actually kind of representing the gamut of all the different variables that you might encounter, right? So we think that we have a pretty repeatable process, of fairly, I would say, scientific process for being able to uncover those levels of abstraction and say, hey, here's process injection. There's actually 18 different procedures. And so we want to choose the procedures that are going to be maximally differentiated, okay? We also have a security control evaluation. So the idea is you have a bunch of security controls. Some of them you're explicitly aware of, some of them you're not. And so as a result of the Purple Team testing, we're going to kind of give you feedback along 3 different measurements, whether the test was prevented, whether it was detected, and whether or not it was perceived, right? And so that would be you had telemetry. And the value, actually, I personally think the perception is probably the most useful bit, because that tells you whether or not you have the ability to improve, right? If you don't have perception, then you're not going to be able to improve. And so you're going to have to kind of either create your own or buy some new sensor that's going to give you that ability, right? We also like to evaluate controls independently. So the idea here is that if I have 5 tests and I detect them all, that's great, right? But the devil's in the details. Did I detect all 5 tests with a single rule, or did I detect all 5 tests across 5 rules? Because remember, what we're doing with this sampling is we're making inference, right? And so the inference that I can draw from detecting 5 diverse tests using 1 rule is that rule is fairly robust, right? But the inference that I can make when I detect 5 tests with 5 rules is that those rules are brittle. They're only going to be like the only inference that I can make is that each of those tests or those signatures or detections are designed to detect that particular test, right? That doesn't mean that that's true. That's just the inference that I could draw as a result of the outcome. Okay. All right. Then we have education. So like I said, with the golden ticket example, you can't detect or prevent what you don't understand. And so instead of just giving you kind of that chart that says you detected this, you prevented this, you have telemetry for this, what we want to do is we want to work through the idea of how the different techniques work. So, what is the technique? What are the different ways that the technique can be used? Why would an attacker choose to implement this version instead of that version? What are the value propositions that attackers are getting? What are the different telemetry sources that might be useful for detecting these? So we try to have like an educational component for every technique. It's almost like a mini masterclass on each technique that we're going to present as a result of the exercise. And then lastly, we try to help model solutions. So let's say that you don't detect some test. We have a strategy for how do you choose which operation or which events you might want to use to build a detection from. And so the idea here is again, previously I showed for this classic shellcode injection type approach, we have telemetry for each of these operations, right? Open process API call, NT allocate virtual memory, remote API calls, so on and so forth. But which one should we build as the foundation? And generally speaking, there's a whole strategy to this. Thread create is going to be the optimal thing to look for, because that's kind of gives you the maximum information that you can get, right? If you observe thread creation. Okay. But the problem is what happens when you have a second procedure or operation chain that doesn't have thread create? Well, in this case, APC create is going to be the thing that I'm interested in, right? So I'm interested in the APC creation. There may be valuable information from all of these, but like as a foundational element of my detection rule, I'm interested in the APC create. But what happens, so that's all great when you're trying to build one rule for one operational chain. But what happens when you combine those operational chains, right? And in this case, you have to look at what do these things have in common. And in this case, you can't use the optimal for each independent chain. You have to use the optimal for the aggregated chain. And so in this case, this is why as you increase the scope of your detection rules, essentially, and you try to deal with different variations or different operational chains or different procedures, the error, right, false positives, essentially, or false negatives, must increase, right? Because as soon as you have a situation to where they're not the exact same chain, you're going to have to move back, and you're going to have to, you're using a more error-prone kind of starting point. And so that's one of the things that we try to help people understand is, hey, what is the optimal place to detect? What is the optimal point at which maybe you need two different detection rules to deal with, these things because they're fundamentally different? What is the cost going to be of trying to build a single detection for multiple procedures? All that kind of stuff. So we have a pretty good track record, I would say, of kind of working with customers to kind of figure out how to use their technology to be able to try to solve these types of problems. So with that, I'm going to go to questions. So, yeah, so, okay, so how do I do this? I just click answer live. Is that the right way? I might do that. So Antonio's asking, he's commenting on the observations are not necessarily predictive of future actions, right? So the question isn't it probable enough using current threat intel? Maybe that's the answer. Like the answer is I don't think we actually know, to be honest. Depends on how the threat intel was derived, I would imagine. So the idea is like, if I observed somebody doing something yesterday, does that mean that they're going to do the same thing tomorrow? Maybe. I may have just caught them, like, I don't know what factors go into their decision making, right? So like, for instance, maybe there was some environmental factor, like let's say breach. I got to kind of like scope it down a little bit just to give some examples, but let's say I have a breach report and they analyzed malware, they analyzed the logs, and they came up with this report that says what the actor did. So the question is did that actor do the same thing that they do every single time? Or did they do certain things because the environment dictated that they act in a certain way? And I think a lot of times we don't know the answer to that. And then the follow-up question is are actors using the extent of their capabilities, or are they using kind of that minimal stimulus necessary approach? I would say that, like, if I was trying to, there's kind of like, we go towards, in the face of uncertainty, you have to have a default assumption, right? And so we see this all the time with like default on firewalls. It's like, do we have a default deny or do we have a default allow, right? And the idea is like, well, we should probably default deny because that's a more secure kind of standard. But there's some debate about that, and different use cases might dictate a different default condition. In my approach to detection, I would say that it's, if I had to pick a default, I would default to assuming that I'm ignorant, as opposed to assuming that I know what the attacker's going to do. And so I would say that that's kind of the philosophical idea. And there's going to be different schools of thought on that, right? So it's like, yes, could previous reporting be indicative of future events? Yes, of course it can. But I don't know that that's an assumption that we should make based on my perception of like my risk tolerance. But I think as a consultant, I would of course work with my customers or clients to understand what their risk tolerance is and what their amount of resources that they're trying to like kind of put towards that. So hopefully that is a decent answer for that. Antonio also asked, for me, the abstraction is the technique. and all of these possible combinations of functions is a procedure. Is this how you understand it? Yeah, so I actually think that there's like a multi-tiered hierarchy, right? Essentially, so a tactic is an abstraction, right? So people that know me are gonna make fun of me for this, but I use apples as an example, right? So everything that we encounter in life exists within some abstraction hierarchy, right? And so you have, when you go to the store and you want to buy an apple, you don't go and say, hey, like, I don't know, my wife sends me to the store and she's like, hey, we need some apples for our son or whatever. She doesn't tell me I need fruit for our son, but apples are fruit, right? They're simultaneously apples, Granny Smith, so they're simultaneously Granny Smith apples, which you could say is like a subordinate category. They're apples, which is kind of like this base level category. They're fruit, which is a superordinate category. They're food, right? And so it keeps going on and on. And so the major question is, well, there's two questions. One is, what are the levels of the abstraction? And I would argue that tactics and techniques are levels of abstraction, and then procedures is basically smashing numerous levels together, right? And so that, like, the problem is that the technique, as you go higher in the abstraction, you become more inclusive, and what that means is that you have less distinction that's involved, right? And so the problem is when you only view the world at a level of abstraction that's not that's not how you see the world. Now you can't act properly. So like I said, we don't see process injection, right? But we do see process execution, right? And so like that's one level of abstraction, is the literal instance, right? So the literal tool that's being run on the computer, that is a level of abstraction, right? That's the lowest, like essentially the lowest level of abstraction. And we see that. But the idea is that we want to get to the point to where we've maximized the abstraction while still being able to use it. And I think that one of the big problems with the TTP model is that basically there's numerous levels of abstraction that are hidden behind procedures, and we don't define that. So the way that I look at it is, you have the literal, you have the functional, which are the API functions, you have the operational chain, and then you have the technique, basically. And so I would say that a procedure, from my perspective, is the operational chain, not the literal instance of the tool. So, yeah. Okay, so when joining a new organization to lead a threat hunt team, that has been in operation for over 1 year, what are the first things you would look for to assess? So that's from somebody anonymous. I like, one of the big things about threat hunting. Okay, so the way that I think about threat hunting is, you have it's almost like, not to get political, but you have like conservatism and you have liberalism, or progressivism, I guess. Conservatism and progressivism is probably a good way to express the poles of the thing, right? And so the way that I see the SOC, for instance, is the SOC is extraordinarily conservative. So the idea is that you want to be extremely efficient. You want to have standard operating procedures, right? You want to minimize error, and you want to do that, right? But the problem with that is that is the error that you're minimizing is essentially false positives, right? But then you're increasing the likelihood of false negatives, right? So you're sacrificing one type of error in order to deal with the other, right? And over time, the SOC is going to become stale, right? So the SOC needs constant injection of kind of new ideas in order to potentially continue growing and keeping pace with kind of the advancement of the adversary. And so threat hunting originally, I think, came about from this realization that SOCs were becoming stale, and it's become kind of this like almost like a progressive force, in the sense that it's always trying to push the boundary, trying to be on the bleeding edge, trying to do things at a smaller scope, but it has more flexibility to kind of like do analysis and all that kind of stuff. But like, you couldn't just take threat hunting and integrate it into the SOC. There has to be a process by which you say, because the SOC literally can't handle the amount of stuff that the threat hunters are doing. One of the big problems that I see, there's usually consternation between this, maybe not usually, but it's definitely been something that I've encountered on numerous times, both personally and as a consultant. The consternation often comes from either the threat hunter is kind of implying that the SOC doesn't know what they're doing, or they're stupid, even though that they're naturally filling two different problems, like they're solving two different problems. But the other issue is that often the SOC perceives that the threat hunters aren't providing anything back to the organization that's that will transcend time, basically. And so one of the things that I would look for as a threat hunt lead is how are we taking the bleeding edge work that we're doing on the threat hunt team and integrating it back into the steady state. So like the goal, the idea is that SOCs get stale over time, and we need to constantly be trying to improve that. But if you don't integrate your discoveries back into the SOC, then you're not actually achieving that goal. And so that's a huge problem that we encounter. So hopefully that gives you an idea. So it's like, how well does how well integrated is the threat hunting team with the SOC process, and how are they trying to improve the SOC over time? Is kind of the idea. Okay. So we got another anonymous attendee. So agreed with all. How, as an industry, do we actually get the funding knowledge to do this level of analysis? As a mid-sized org, there's no way we'll have the funding or skills to actually do this. Yeah, so that's something that I get tons of feedback on. One thing is that over time, like, I'm doing it, and I'm trying to make the results as public as possible, so that people can kind of get that, even if they don't have the organic skill. One of the things that I find is when it comes to reverse engineering, the amount of reverse engineering skill that you have to have in order to do this type of analysis is actually not that high. Like, I'm by no means a reverse engineer. I don't know all the details about assembly. I can't just look at assembly language. But the cool thing is that the thing that we are interested in are function calls, and generally speaking, those are easier to identify. And so one of the things is just kind of showing people that it's easier than they think it is. And that's why we created this workshop. So one of the things is, you know, I kind of created this philosophy, and we started actually working this through with some of our colleagues at SpecterOps. And we actually kind of got feedback to where we had an expectation of what they would do. And then at the end of the week that we assigned them to do this work, we found that nobody really achieved the specific outcome that we were hoping for. And that wasn't an indictment on them. That was an indictment on us, right? And so we hadn't sufficiently broken down the problem such that they could attain success. But then what we did is we kind of refocused it. And this is actually what has fed into this malware morphology workshop that I talked about at NorthSec. And the idea is we came up with a framework to where we took I would say, like, in the reverse engineering space, a relatively inexperienced consultant, and he was able to produce the exact output that I expected. And a lot of these tool graphs where I had like the function chain at the top, the call stacks, and then the operation chain, that all actually was derived from his work, to where he presented it in kind of a novel way. And I was like, oh, that's really useful. And like, he did that all just by following this framework for how to analyze malware samples, right? And so hopefully, as we kind of teach this workshop more and more, make it more publicly available, people will kind of gain the experience, and also will build up a bigger corpus over time, to where if you don't have the time or the funding or the resources, we'll just give you the output. And so that's kind of the way that we're going to try to answer that, I suppose. All right, Christian's asking, would you still recommend using threat hunting heat map, or prefer to review latest observations from red team ops and pen test findings? I don't I know that the heat map kind of has like a negative connotation these days. I don't think it's terrible, but again, the devil's in the details, right? So it's like there's the binary aspect of, do you have a detection for this technique? But assuming that your single detection actually solves the problem of that technique is silly, to be honest. So like, there's no chance you're ever going to solve the vast majority of techniques, I should say, with a single detection. So you're almost always going to need multiple detections. And so the question is how do you basically represent through testing or through research the scope of variation that exists within a technique, and how do you make sure that you've addressed that? Okay, so Anonymous says, what indicators between two test cases determine they are different enough to be considered valuable for a purple team exercise? So I'm just going to go back in the slides because I think this is something that we could show. Okay, so generally speaking, you can look at two different chains and you can say, where do things line up and where do they not line up? And so what we see here, you know, for process injection, there's kind of three things that are happening, right? So one is like, what code are you injecting? It could be shell code, it could be a DLL, it could be an executable file. Then it's like, how are you injecting it? And then how are you executing it? And so one of the things that we see here is that the difference between atom bombing and APC injection is that they're changing the way that they're allocating the memory, right? And so the problem is that, especially when it comes to vendor detections, we don't know what it is that they're focused on, right? So we don't know how, like, what is the aspect of the operation chain that they most care about, right? And so we kind of have to figure that out through a varied testing approach. And so one thing that we might do is if we run APC injection and they detect it, like this operation chain, but then we run atom bombing and they don't detect it, now we can start to infer what it is that they're focused on as a result of their as a result of the outcome of the tests, right? And so the idea is that we can look at this and say the only thing that really changed between these two operation chains is that instead of doing kind of like the traditional allocation of memory, they used atoms to change it up. And so maybe that means that the vendor has over indexed on the traditional version of allocation as opposed to being a little bit more robust to that approach. So generally speaking, if there is a major difference in form, this is why we call it malware morphology. So morphology is like the difference in form when it comes to like either language, linguistics, or when it comes to like organisms, such as like body form for like the difference between a dog and a human. But also when it comes to malware, what's the morphological features of that are different? Well, the way that they inject the code, they put the code in memory or allocate the code in memory is a major difference. And so that would be relatively likely to change the assumptions or challenge the assumptions of the detection rule. So it's like the more morphologically different two things are, the better it is to probably test those things, but you're gonna want to test as much of that as possible. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So then the next question: how do you decide when is the detection robust enough? Perfection can be the enemy of good. Yeah. So this is like the 80-20 rule type thing. So like 20% of effort gets you 80% of result, and 20% of effort gets you, or like the last 20% of result requires 80% of effort. I would say that I agree with that as a principle, right? And maybe 80% is good enough, especially considering attack techniques don't happen in a vacuum. And so like just because you're 80% on this doesn't mean that you're not going to detect the overall attack chain, right? So they could bypass this one detection, but then you have other detections that hopefully complement it. The challenge that I give to people is that I don't think that anybody has the ability to accurately evaluate currently whether they're at 80%, right? So people will make the claim that they have an 80% solution, and then I'll think like it'll be something that I'm quite familiar with, and I'm like, you don't even have anywhere close to an 80% solution. So it's this thing of like, yeah, 80% or like, perfect is the enemy of good, but you're assuming that you're good when you're not. And so that's the thing that we're trying to do with this is, I'm not claiming that I know every variation, every operational chain that somebody could use for process injection. But what I am trying to do is I'm trying to create a model that represents what I do know in an explicit fashion. And then I'm trying to evaluate how somebody performs against that model, right? And so like I would say, generally speaking, most current approaches are relatively ad hoc in that manner. So it's like, I saw this one tool one time, and so maybe I should add that to my test case. And I saw this other thing, and maybe that's different. And what happens is a lot of times the tests are redundant. So you'll see things like invoke Mimikatz versus standard Mimikatz. And it's like, the difference is that one of them is using reflective DLL injection. One of them is just running a binary in a normal fashion. But at the end of the day, the behavior is exactly the same. So it's quite redundant outside of that injection aspect of it. Okay, let's see. Just to make sure, I'm good to keep going. I personally have no problem going and answering more questions. Sarah or Helena, is there any actual like hard stop on this? While I'm waiting for that, I'll kind of keep talking. So Antonio is asking, when a detection on a single operation or procedure is too noisy and would potentially cause a multitude of false positive alerting, now you're in a situation where you might have to build your detection alert based on a chain of techniques. This can then turn into exponential combination of possible procedures and operations. How do you go about building an alert detection with this in mind? Yeah, that's a really hard question to answer, but generally speaking, I think one of the major things that we do wrong in the industry is we conflate multiple decisions together, right? And so the way that I think about it, so in detection theory, so there's actually a like academic field called detection theory. They distinguish in detection between two subphases. One is called detection, so that makes it a little bit convoluted, and the other is called discrimination, right? And so the first step is detecting the signal in the first place. So like if So let's say I'm trying to detect, this is kind of a silly one, but if I'm trying to detect malicious service creation, right? The detection question of the detection subphase would be how confident am I that if a service were created, I would know about it, right? And I think there's a lot of the times we think we're better at that than we actually are, is maybe as an industry, right? So like service creation is by no means a trivial thing to detect, right? But then the second question, which is harder, right, is, okay, once I've identified all service creations, how do I discriminate between malicious and benign services? And the way that I think about this, there's this book called It's Not Complicated by who's it by? Oh, I actually have it right here. It's by a guy named Rick Nason. And the way that he looks at this is like businesses often have issues because they conflate complicated and complex problems together. And there's this problem to where to most of us in like colloquial speech, complicated and complex are the same thing. They're synonyms. But in like a scientific approach, complex means that it's technically difficult to solve, but once you've solved it, it's repeatable, right? So you have an algorithm like, the theory of relativity is a complicated problem because, yeah, it took a brilliant person to figure it out, but now that person created an algorithm and I could apply that myself, and I'm, not a physicist. And then you have complex problems, which are problems that technically have no right answer. So like the macro economy is probably a complex system, right? And so it's like we don't even know what all the variables in the macro from a macroeconomic sense are, and we definitely can't control all of those variables, and therefore it's something that like we're doing our best at. So the idea is that you can solve complex problems, you can solve complicated problems but not complex problems. The problem that I see in cybersecurity is that we try to solve all those with one question. So the detection rule is trying to do both detection and discrimination simultaneously. But we could look at my strategy would be, the way that you do this is you try to glean or inherit wisdom, I guess, from other existing systems. So like the medical diagnosis system is a good example. It's like you wake up in the morning and you have a pain in the side of your abdomen. That could either mean that you're going to die in six weeks, or it could mean literally nothing, right? And so what you do is you go to the doctor and they run a blood test, and a blood test is relatively non-invasive. It's relatively inexpensive, and they look at your blood levels, and there's different things that they might look for, and like there's ranges and all that kind of stuff. And then if you come back with like an abnormal range, maybe they send you to go do a CT scan so that they could kind of do some imaging. And then maybe I don't know, after that, they go and do a biopsy, but you don't want to do a biopsy on every single person that has a side ache. And so you want to kind of build your way up. And the idea is that you're getting more and more information as you progress, but you're gating spending resources. So you don't want to spend the maximum resources on every single situation, because then you're wasting resources, right? And so what you want to do is you want to spend the minimal number of resources necessary to get the maximal information you can to identify whether it's worth investing additional resources. And so I think one of the major ways that we need to solve this is more philosophical than like the literal answer to your question, but the way we need to solve this is we need to allow ourselves more runway to make decisions, basically, and break up the process into more steps, basically. Okay, so Brandon's asking, can you talk through the educational component as integrated into the SpecterOps purple team engagement? Is it a follow-up to the red team style testing? Yeah, so okay, so the way that we've implemented that thus far, and we're definitely open for feedback on this, is we essentially do a technique a day of the assessment. So it could be one or two techniques, kind of depending on the scope of the technique, but we essentially do one technique a day, and we try to present that technique in its full glory, kind of as enough variations to where we get a really good idea of kind of the scope of our efficacy against that technique, right? The way that we start the day is we kind of do an educational component of, hey, today we're going to be talking about process injection. Here's what process injection is. Here's why attackers use it. And then there's a number of different variations of process injection. Here's the reasons why an attacker might choose to do this thing, right? So a lot of people have started looking at create remote thread. And so what they did is they introduced APCs as a way to execute code without creating a new thread. I wrote a tool called get injected thread, which looked for like injected threads in a certain way. And so there's actually been a number of new variations of process injection that are kind of attacking the kind of strategy used by get injected thread. So what they'll do, like one of the things it did is it looked for threads that were executing code that didn't have like a file on disk that it was loaded from. So basically code that didn't go through the Windows loader, basically. And so what attackers started doing is they do like module stomping, they call it, which is where they'll load up some module that they don't care about, and then they'll just they'll figure out where that module's loaded, and then they'll allocate their malicious code to an existing module. Instead of calling like virtual alloc, they'll say, hey, here's a module I know I don't need, and so getting rid of it's not going to do anything. Module being a DLL. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to write my malicious code to that location, then I'm going to point this thread to that location and execute the code. And so now when I check it with get injected thread, a PowerShell script, it's going to appear to be, file X, even though it's not actually file X. So like we kind of talk through those types of conversations of why attackers choose to do different things, and like the different kind of stimulus that would cause different types of evolution, you could say, of tradecraft. Hopefully that, Brandon, gives you an idea. Mark's asking, what is the process and differentiator of your purple team service against other vendors? I would say that the major differentiators is our test selection, right? So one major differentiator that you should pay attention to as a consumer, and this is almost like a philosophical school of thought kind of approach, right? Do you want breadth or do you want depth? I have a very strong opinion about depth being more valuable than breadth, but you may not agree with me, right? And so if you don't agree with me and you're looking for something like, I want to maximize the number of techniques that are being tested as part of our purple team exercise, like our solution probably isn't going to align with your expectations. I'll just be honest with that. I don't think that that's particularly useful. You may disagree with me. So one of them is we're using kind of the dynamic test case example to where like we don't have to work it into a coherent attack path, basically. Like that's not the problem. What we're trying to do is exercise a number of variations of a single technique. Now, the thing that we think is like actually a technical differentiator is we think that we have a better strategy for selecting which techniques we have. And the purpose of the webinar was to kind of show that process and how that works and how you can basically, there's more abstractions than just TTPs. There's a number of different layers of abstraction and how you choose which abstraction level is the optimal. And so the way that we do that is we say, what do we actually see? Well, we see operations, right? We see a thread was created, a process handle was opened. We see a, memory was allocated. That's what we actually see. And from that perspective, that means that the level that we should think about the problem is at the level of those operations, because that's what we see. And so we have a strategy for technically evaluating what those operations are, and then identifying the different, basically, operational variations. And so that would be the major technical differentiator. We also have this educational component, which we think is pretty valuable. So it's like a series of micro classes that talk about like master classes on these different techniques. So hopefully that gives a pretty good idea. Okay. How do I validate if that my EDR is generating a detection based off of the current set of operations and not just some kind of advanced YARA rule? Yeah. This gets into kind of moving that small part of the scale. So I just like the visual. I thought this was clever, so hopefully people like this. So this is that small part of the scale. So one of the things that you might do, like when you start off, right? And actually, where is it? This visualization I think is quite useful. So at first, you want to test the most significant change, right? And so the idea is that the operation is once you make a change that's at a level higher than the operation, now you've changed techniques essentially. And so then it's a completely different problem that you're dealing with, right? And so within the context of a single technique, operational changes, so changes to that operational chain, are the most significant change that can be made, right? And so those are representative of this big weight here. And so the idea would be you first want to represent a number of different operational changes, right? But then what you can do is you can start to kind of fine tune And that's where you would start playing around with this guy. So let's say you detect test number 3 and it's like in the blue. One of your questions is like, hey, did they just detect that because they happen to know that that was a sample that they were expecting? And the way that you start to do that is you start to make micro changes along the functional level. So you start making changes at the functional level. Maybe you call syscalls instead of the Win32 API calls. Maybe you call some random functions that like most people normally wouldn't call, right? Because then it's unlikely that EDR vendors have addressed that. So there's like these major changes, and I think like to start off, most of the time you're going to want to focus on the major changes, which are those operational changes. But then you can start to, let's say I detect number 1, I detect number 2, I detect number 3, but I don't detect number 4. Now I know that everything broke somewhere between number 3 and number 4, right? So the question is where exactly did it break? Did it break right at number 4, or did it really break somewhere, kind of in this indigo section? And so then you can start making micro changes, creating new tests that would allow you to kind of fine tune your evaluation of where things break. So that hopefully that kind of answers that question. All right. Any frameworks or documentation templates you recommend to keep track of purple team testing? I would say that I'm probably not the best resource for that. I would we kind of like do it our own way, and we haven't publicized it yet, but I would say that so Zena has that. She did that PhD thesis. It's like way back here. Let me see if I could find it quickly. This is at least the most comprehensive resource on purple teaming. So if it's not there, then it's probably not anywhere. So it's Cheerio is her GitHub username, and it's Enterprise Purple Teaming. I'd recommend checking that out, and it's pretty well like organized and things to try to find those types of answer those types of questions. I guess I haven't been pushing done, but okay. The problem seems somewhat more complex issue here, as I also need to layer the available telemetry over the possible number of unique operations to determine how to set my base condition. Yeah. So this anonymous, I don't see who it was, but it sounds like you're using some language that kind of I use. So I think that you probably have been following along some of the stuff that we've talked about. Yeah. So one of the problems that we have, I'm trying to find the example here, is, yeah, we have these different operations, but something that I mentioned that I kind of glossed over was you can only see one thing at a time, right? And so like a lot of times people will kind of come back and say, oh, well, I actually see 2 things because I'm looking at both network connections and process creations at the same time. Those are 2 different operations. But the problem is that that's a join, and that join is dependent upon like you either have to say, show me network connections and their associated processes, or show me processes and their associated network connections. So there's always something that comes first. And that first thing is what I call kind of the base condition or base operation. And so the question is how do you choose which one? Well, first of all, it's dependent on what telemetry you have. So you can't choose an operation if you don't have telemetry for it, right? And so actually what I like to do is kind of rank order each operation. Really quickly, there's this idea called necessity and sufficiency, right? So necessity is, in order to accomplish the goal, process injection, this step is necessary for is a necessary operation. And then sufficiency is, if I observe this operation, I can infer that the goal has been attained. So if I observe this thing, then I could infer that process injection has occurred. The way that I choose like I said that, hey, this is optimal. The way that I would choose optimal is I look for the operation that is both necessary and sufficient. There's a whole discussion. This could be a whole presentation on its own, but that's essentially the operation that minimizes false positives and false negatives is kind of the idea. And then then if you were to, let's say, then you check and say, do I have telemetry on that? If the answer is no, then you need to say, okay, well, what's number 2? And I personally choose to go in the direction of necessary, but other people choose to go in the direction of sufficient. The rub, I guess, is that if you go in the direction of necessary, you're minimizing false negatives. That I'm not saying you're eliminating false negatives, you're minimizing false negatives, because in order to do process injection, you must do this thing, right? So it's necessary for process injection. That means there's no possibility for false negatives. But you're going to accrue more and more false positives as a result of that. Other people who are more false positive sensitive, you could say, they would go in the direction of sufficient, which is going to allow for more false negatives, right? Because just because it's sufficient doesn't mean that you have to do it, right? So it's going to allow for false negatives, which are the best example is LSAS credential dumping. You have open process, process read, file write. So you make a dump file, right? Open process is necessary but not sufficient. Process read is necessary and sufficient, and file write is sufficient but not necessary, right? And so you could actually observe different people's reaction or different people's detection rules and start to see whether they're more false positive sensitive or false negative sensitive based on how they err, like which direction they choose to error in. And that's, again, another philosophical school of thought. So if somebody builds their credential dumping detections primarily focused on file writing for the dump file, then that's going to be somebody who's more sensitive to false positives than false negatives. If somebody uses the process open, then that means that they're more sensitive to false negatives than false positives. And I don't know that there's actually a right answer, but that's kind of like what your risk tolerance is and how you want to approach that. But yeah, okay. So then the actual question was, what about telemetry? So then it's a question of, I've rank ordered these. So the way I would do it is necessary and sufficient, necessary only, sufficient only, and then neither. And the way that and then what you do is you say, okay, for this one that's number one, the most optimal operation, do I have telemetry for that? Yes or no? If the answer is no, can I get telemetry for that? No. Okay, well, let me go to the number two, which is necessary. Then the kind of the final thing I'll say is that in the case these three are all necessary for this operational chain. So then how do I differentiate between two necessary operations? The way that I would do that is I would say you choose the one that's later in the chain. And the reason is that there's more reasons why I might allocate memory than there are why I might write to a process. And so the idea is that the further along the chain I get, the less possible alternative paths I might take. And so you want to minimize the number of paths. And so as you want to basically focus on something that's further along in the path, assuming that it's at least the same level of necessary and or sufficient. Okay. Hopefully that gives an idea. Okay. Cool. Thank you, Daniel. Daniel gave a compliment. We try to, we're kind of allergic to, I know Helena actually is our marketing director at SpecterOps, and she had to drop, so I could say this now. We've traditionally been a little allergic to marketing, so we try to announce the thing, but we also want it to not be overly marketing feeling. So hopefully I achieve that. Isn't it more efficient query-wise to push selecting factors left? So by discriminating while you're identifying, you save some resources. Yes. So Anonymous is asking basically, there's this thing like filter left, which is make your filtering decision as early on as possible. And yes, that is more efficient, but it's potentially more error prone. And so the more false negative prone in particular. And so the idea is you want to make as many filtering decisions as you can as far left in the pipeline. So your detection pipeline, telemetry generation, telemetry collection, SIM ingestion, detection rule, alerting, investigation. You want to make it you want to filter as far left as possible, but you always need to be cognizant of how that affects your false negative rate. And false negative rate's a really complex one because false negatives, naturally, the whole point of a false negative is that you don't see anything, you don't get any signal that you have false negatives. And a lot of times false negatives are actually predictions. So what is a false negative? It's not about how many false negatives you have, because actual attacks are quite rare. And so your false negative rate will always be low. But it's about what is the probability that if an attack were to happen, I would have a false negative. That's what you should be asking. And so that's something to keep in mind. But yes, generally speaking, like that doctor thing that I talked about, it's generally speaking, the doctor wants to eliminate as many people from the doctor is going to ask you some questions and send you to get a blood test. Ideally, the doctor would send as few people as possible to get a blood test. And ideally, the doctor would only send people that actually have some disease to go get a blood test. But the problem is that the doctor is just asking you questions about how you feel. So it's very low resolution. And so there there are going to be some cases where, based on those questions, it's like, you're definitely don't have any problems, and so I'm not going to send you to get a blood test. But like, generally speaking, I think in medicine, it's worse to have, you have two types of misdiagnoses, right? So one is a false positive, where you diagnose somebody as having a disease and they don't, or you send somebody to go get a blood test and they didn't need it, right? And then the other is that somebody actually needed a blood test because they actually do have a disease, and you sent them home, right? Generally speaking, in medicine, we think that sending a sick person home is worse, a worse type of error, right? They're both errors, but we think that sending the sick person home is worse. And so we err in the direction of sending people to get blood tests. But we use that as a secondary, a higher resolution measure, which is also still relatively inexpensive, both in time and money, to get a better picture of who needs to get the CT scan. And then we're able to make another elimination decision there as well. So yes, generally speaking, that's what we want to do. Okay, yeah, Jeff added, yeah, both. He first said hi, so thank you, Jeff. Hi, buddy. Glad you can make it. But also, from a red teamer perspective, one of the things that he brings up is that he prefers to steal other people's breath. So it's like, if I'm trying to do something that I don't normally do, I'm kind of interpreting it a little bit, but like, if I'm trying to do something that I don't normally do, I'll just go grab something off of GitHub or whatever, right? But if I'm trying to actually do evasion, I'm going to create something custom. And so that's actually kind of that potentially is a good kind of principle to keep in mind, and is that breadth is like, the public things are going to, generally speaking, be relatively high level, and they're going to be on the spectrum closer. Things that are public are going to be closer to kind of the canonical example, right? So Mimikatz is the canonical example. The vast majority of tools that are publicly available are slight derivations from, or slight variations from the form of Mimikatz. But that doesn't mean that it has to be only a slight difference, right? So thank you for that, Jeff. Yeah, how many days does your purple team engagement run, and how many hours does it take? A day does it take? So we try to do like a 2-week execution window, although that's potentially something that's adjustable. It just would cost more or less depending on how it gets adjusted. And we, like I said, we generally aim for like one technique a day. We found that doing more than that at the level of depth that we're doing it, most people aren't able to consume that amount of information, and so it's not particularly useful, because it's like you kind of overwhelm their capacity. I would say that like the interaction, so usually we'll need like a POC that's going to be kind of on call to help us kind of get things set up, especially initially. That's going to be heavier lift at the very beginning of the exercise, just because we need access into the network and things like that. And then I would say that we do that educational component. Maybe that's like an hour a day. And that's kind of like, it's not mandatory, but it's recommended. It's like free training basically. So, but that could be as open as people want it to be. So it's like, you could invite anybody from the company, and we actually don't care. And then there's going to be some back and forth, just asking questions, but it's not, I would say that like, we find, and this may be another aspect of a differentiator, could be positive or negative depending on your perspective, to like, we find that like having a live open Zoom call with the client, first of all, most of our clients don't have the time to dedicate to that, and so it kind of fell apart. But also, I'm not sure that it's particularly a useful like use of their time. So it ends up being more time consuming than the ROI actually produces. And so we find that like 1 hour, or like 1 hour's a guesstimate. It could be longer, it could be shorter, at the beginning of the day, where we go through kind of the results of the previous day, and also explain what's going to happen for the day and all the different aspects of it. That tends to be kind of enough. So it's pretty low impact from that perspective, but it's also flexible to kind of your needs. Like, we're happy to spend more time if people want that. All right. Thank you, Jose. Appreciate you. Okay. Have you ever had a purple team where LDAP and SMB is killed off? What are your next steps if you haven't, and what would you think about doing? Yeah, I haven't encountered that, but that basically, it's the idea is that LDAP and SMB are going to be precursors to a number of different techniques, and so how does that affect? It's like kind of like, how would that affect your technique selection, I suppose? I would say that would be something that we would probably want to discuss with the POC like in advance, because that will affect which techniques we would choose. I don't know exactly which techniques we would actually choose as a result of that, but that would be something that we would want to know in advance to kind of know. Well, first of all, we would want to test whether or not LDAP and SMB is actually turned off, because any red teamer could tell you that they've encountered a client that says you shouldn't be able to do X, and then they do X, right? So we got to be careful about that assumption, but that would be something that we would probably want to test explicitly. And then that would also affect the techniques that we would choose as part of our testing protocol. AI tools even become an option for the public option. ChatGPT. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So that looks like all the questions. Just happy to, oh, okay, that one just came in, it looks like. Okay, so this one says, do you guys need access to the EDR, AV, SIM platforms during the Purple Team engagement? Yeah, so needs an interesting word. If we don't have access to the EDR, AV, or SIM platform, then that would hinder our ability to evaluate the outcome, right? So one solution to that would be we leave the evaluation aspect of it to you. So we're just stimulating the kind of exercise. And you could I assume that inherent in this is that maybe you're hesitant to want to give us access to the EDR, AV, or SIM platform. And so that's how I'm going to answer the question. So to say, like, we've had clients that are able to give us cloud access. So maybe somebody has MDE and they're able to like give us credentials for cloud access to Sentinel or whatever. We've also had clients that ship us laptops to where we kind of access their things through a VPN solution. Potentially we would be open to doing like going on sites. We just haven't traveled as much post COVID, but like I don't know that would necessarily be a negative thing. That would change probably the pricing of the exercise, I would say. So there's a number of different ways that we could solve that like access problem depending on your sensitivities to that. I would say that we also have had situations, not with Purple Teams, but with other exercises that we've done, to where they didn't want to give us access to the thing. And that just changes kind of what our ability to deliver value will be, right? And so what we would change to is more of we're executing the attacks, and it's kind of on you to evaluate whether or not, you prevent. We'll know about prevention. So prevention is like, it didn't work, right? And so that one's pretty obvious to the red teamer, but detection's really hard for the red teamer to be able to see, the attacker, whatever you want to call it. And so that would be something that you would have to evaluate yourself. The perception and the detection aspect of kind of the evaluation would be out of our control if we don't have access to those things. Cool. All right. So before we drop, I'll give a couple more minutes just in case somebody has a question that I haven't answered. Cool. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. As always, I'm on Twitter, Jared C. Atkinson, or as my friends like to say, Jared Catkinson. So feel free to reach out to me there if you have any further questions. I think this is going to be recorded and available on demand in case anybody wants to check it out later. And so, yeah, appreciate it. And always happy to answer. Check out the DCP podcast, which is the podcast that Johnny Johnson and I host. And we like to talk about these types of topics in depth. So some of these topics have been kind of breached in a little bit like less formal manner. So if you want to find out more about that, any love for Austin FC? I'm a Bayern Munich fan, so I don't really have like an MLS team. Las Vegas is supposed to get one, Leo. So if that happens, then we will be mortal enemies, I suppose. But until then, I don't hate them, but I don't necessarily like them either. All right, guys. Well, appreciate everybody's time, and thank you for joining. And hopefully we'll hear from you soon, whether that's just to kind of chat about the ideas or engage in some sort of Purple Team assessment or something like that. Happy to interact with you in any way. So appreciate your time, and we'll talk to you later.